Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. In this video, I'll go through the new champion point changes that are coming with the High Isle chapter. Since the PTS patch notes released, I've had some time now to dig in a little deeper and do some testing with the champion points, and I'll go through what I found with the Warfare Slottables and go over when will be a good time to use the different options as a PvE damage dealer. To start off, I'll just go through an overview of the changes. There were quite a few adjustments in the Warfare tree, so this is going to have a pretty decent sized impact on how we interact with the slotted nodes here. So they rebalanced the numbers and progression for a number of nodes. Each of these are now a 6% boost down from a 10% boost. Then Backstabber and Fighting Finesse were adjusted as well. Backstabber is now 10% crit damage when flanking instead of 15%. Fighting Finesse is down just a little bit to 8% instead of 10%. Wrathful Strikes and Rejuvenator are both up to 205 weapon and spell damage now instead of 165. Not a huge increase, but Wrathful Strikes is definitely going to make its way into a lot more setups now than it previously did. Then we have Occult Overload. This now deals 12,800 Oblivion damage when maxed out instead of 4,000. It probably still won't be super relevant for a lot of PvE scenarios since it does require you to get the killing blow, but possibly interesting for some very densely packed stacks of enemies if you are solo or in a smaller group. I don't think it will be very relevant in trials. Looks like this will mostly be PvP with a little bit of PvE mixed in. And those are the main relevant adjustments to the existing nodes, but we also have two new champion point nodes in the extended might constellation of the Warfare tree. These are Exploiter. This one increases your damage done against off-balance enemies by 10%. This one is going to be really great for both trash mob encounters as well as very short burst fights or fights with specific phases to them where you can plan from and benefit from off-balance reliably. Off-balance can only be triggered once every 22 seconds and it lasts for 7 seconds, so a 31.8% uptime over the course of a longer encounter when you average it out, assuming the fight has no immune or teleport phases or anything like that where you wouldn't be able to attack anyways. So assuming that perfectly average scenario, this would be about a 3.18% damage boost overall. But like I said, it can definitely be more than that for certain scenarios. So let's say an ad wave lasts only 10 seconds. Well, off balance would be up for nearly all of that. Or if an ad wave lasts for 30 seconds, off balance might be present at the very beginning and the end of that pool, and so it would have a little more value in something like that as well. Also, bosses with specific phases where they come out of immunity and you deal damage to them, but then they go back into an immune phase, you might be able to get a little more out of this for those kinds of scenarios as well. It will just depend on the encounter and the way your group is handling that encounter. It's also worth noting that having an ult dumped like a Destro ult within that off-balance window can also increase its overall effectiveness. So kind of similar to how Mechanical Acuity works with its window of crit chance, it isn't necessarily just the average amount of time spent in off balance, but what you do in that off balance time as well. The next new champion point node is Force of Nature. This increases your offensive penetration by 900 for each status effect your target has. This is just one stage and 50 points to unlock it. This one is a bit more variable than most of our other nodes, but it will have a theoretical max of 7,200 penetration if you happen to have all 8 status effects active. And just as a reminder, these are all the status effects that we have access to. So likely won't have all of these up at once, but it should be pretty easy and even semi-organized trial groups to still have enough of them up to make this pretty useful. I have to say, I do wish they introduced this node with a little less volatility. Light armor users can pretty easily use the crit damage nodes without a lot of thought put into it, while medium armor users are going to have to account for a bit more with this one. If ZOS is dead set on the design here, personally, I'd like to see this one somewhere around 1200 per status effect with a cap of 6k penetration. So 5 status effects would get us there, and that's a lot more reasonable to keep up, especially in smaller groups, and this would allow you to have some overlap as well. If you had more status effects than that, but some were falling off from time to time, you could much more reliably sit at a specific amount rather than bouncing up and down all the time. I definitely don't dislike what we already have right here. I think it's still going to be really strong, but I think it could be tweaked to be a little better, maybe a little easier to keep up, especially for solo play. So now that we know the changes, what does this mean for the way that we set up our loadouts? Well, the real answer is it depends. It depends on your class, it depends on your skill bars, it depends on the encounter that you're facing, and so on. This will be something I'm definitely going to dig a little deeper into when I do DPS builds going forward. But for now, I'm going to use some more generic examples because I think it will still give us a really good idea of the overall landscape of the champion point system and the thought process behind what we'll be choosing as a damage dealer in PvE. So I think that the most relevant nodes for us in group play will still be Biting Aura, Deadly Aim, Master at Arms, and Thaumaturge, plus the 2 crit damage nodes, Backstabber and Fighting Finesse, and then Wrathful Strikes, Exploiter, and Force of Nature will all come into play as well. Untamed Aggression is okay, but I don't think I see it making its way into the top 4 for most setups. I'll also keep Occult Overload out of this discussion, as this will be more math-based, and that one is a bit more of a situational proc, and it likely won't be too appealing for larger groups with that killing blow requirement. Alright, so what we'll do next is look at a few generic builds with some common stats we'd see in a trial encounter. This won't be perfect for every class due to unique skills and buffs, but this should still give us a really good idea overall, as even though the numbers might change slightly with different builds and loadouts, most will have a significant enough gap between them that the applicable results should still hold true for most setups. So first up, we'll look at a generic medium armor build. This one has 8745 weapon and spell damage. Now this might look a little high, but this is for a more coordinated trial group encounter, and I also wanted to make sure I was accounting for Bloodthirsty as well. So yeah, it could be a little higher or lower than what you'd actually be getting depending on how your group is set up. And then we have around 57% crit chance, 115% crit damage, 2 Fighters Guild skills, so those passives were factored into the weapon and spell damage there. Same with the 6 medium armor pieces, and then we have 1 light piece, and then the target damage taken modifier is at 23%. So this includes debuffs like minor vulnerability that increase the target's damage taken. And then the player damage done modifier of 35%. So this includes stuff like minor slayer, major berserk, and other stuff that gives a % increase to our damage done. Then this will also assume we are at the penetration cap. So being that this is a 6 medium armor setup, likely something like Alkosh is being used in this scenario. But don't worry, I'll cover scenarios for non-Alkosh groups as well. So what's the goal of all this? Well, I wanted to put something together that would help me figure out when I should be slotting which nodes. So with the 4 nodes that give us a % damage done increase to a specific type of damage, so Biting Aura, Deadly Aim, Master at Arms, and Thaumaturge, these are all 6% increases. So a good way to look at them is if 100% of our damage comes from, let's say, AoE damage, well, Biting Aura would be a 6% total damage increase. Obviously, that's not really realistic, so let's say 50% of our damage comes from AoE damage, well then Biting Aura is now a 3% total damage increase. So depending on how much damage we are getting from a certain damage type, that will tell us our total damage increase we are getting from these different nodes. Previously, these were all at 10% each, so we often ran into situations where even if we weren't dealing a ton of damage of a certain type, let's say only 35% of our damage was from our damage over time effects, well that was still a 3.5% damage boost from Thaumaturge and often worth slotting over some of our other options. Well, now that that maximum amount is lowered from 10% down to 6%, we are probably going to be looking at doing at least 50% of our damage from a certain type to even begin considering slotting one of those nodes, and often it will take a bit more than that. So what I did here and what we'll go through for the rest of this video, I put some graphs together to compare what % of our damage would need to be a certain type for it to match the same power as some of our other options here. So for example here, if 60% of our damage done was coming from single target damage, well that would put Deadly Aim somewhere here between Wrathful Strikes and Fighting Finesse. Again, the exact specifics of these will change from build to build, but this should be a pretty decent baseline for optimized trial scenarios. And just to make sure you guys understand, let's do one more example. So if I was getting 75% of my damage as AoE damage, Biting Aura would end up right here on the graph. And not too many other nodes would offer us more than that. So in order to figure out what you want to slot, you'll need a decent idea of how much damage you are getting from a specific type. No, not how many abilities you are running of a type, but actually how much damage you are getting from those abilities. So if you are on PC and have the combat metrics add-on, you can easily look through your combat log and just add up the damage from specific types and see what that comes out to. Unfortunately, if you are on console, there won't be a perfect way to look at that. However, if you have at least a decent idea, that should still get you close enough to figure out which node you should be slotting. And it doesn't have to be perfect. If 2 nodes are pretty close and you end up going with the wrong one over the other, it probably doesn't really matter too much in the end. You know, as long as you have a decent idea, it probably won't make too much of a difference. So I'm going to use my Stamina Templar parse here as an example of how we can add this up. Now I'm using this specific one because I actually had all 4 of those nodes slotted for this: Biting Aura, Deadly Aim, Master at Arms, and Thaumaturge. So if we only had some of these present, it would skew our results a bit, but since they are all present, we can look at the total output and get a good idea. You could also test with none of them slotted if you want, but just make sure you have all or none if you want to get in here and really nerd out over the numbers. So if we look at our direct damage here, that's the 1 Master at Arms boost. Adding up all of these comes out to about 57.5% of our total damage. So that would place it very close to probably the same results we'd get from the 205 weapon and spell damage from Wrathful Strikes. Whereas on the flip side of that, about 42.5% of our damage is from dots. So Thaumaturge is going to be further down the line, closer to the 150 weapon and spell damage we get from Untamed Aggression. Now let's plot Biting Aura and Deadly Aim. Biting is our AoE damage and Deadly Aim is our single target damage. So in this particular setup, 59.2% of our damage was single target and 40.8% was AoE. So we can plot these on the graph and see that the top 4 overall here are Backstabber, Fighting Finesse, Deadly Aim, and Master at Arms. Now remember, we do have a crit damage cap here and we are in 6 medium, so maybe you end up not needing one or both of those crit damage nodes. So let's say we drop both of those because we're already at the cap. You would end up slotting Deadly Aim, Master at Arms, Wrathful Strikes, and Exploiter. And do remember what we talked about earlier with Exploiter. It will vary from situation to situation. So this is just the average that we would get over a static encounter with Exploiter. So this may jump up even higher depending on what kind of scenario we're in. And all of this will vary with different loadouts. So with an AoE trash setup, for example, Biting R would probably be much higher and definitely worth slotting over Deadly Aim, or possibly on a very heavy AoE class like Necromancer. So this is just one specific example. You'll want to plug in your nodes based on your specific setup. All right, let's talk about Force of Nature now. In this example, we are already at the pin cap, so this would likely be in a group that already has Alkosh or other pin sets going. So we aren't really gaining anything here from Force of Nature since we are already at 6 medium and we're already at the pin cap. However, let's say we are running in a group with most of the other damage dealers all running light armor, and so the group has decided not to use Alkosh. But we want to be a Giga Chad medium armor user anyways. So I put this graph together, and this one assumes everything about the build is the same as the last example, except there is no Alkosh present, so we end up about 5,500 penetration under the cap. Well, that Force of Nature CP is going to be very appealing to you if you find yourself in this kind of situation. Since that node works off of status effects present, I plotted the comparisons to those upper right champion point nodes at multiple points based on the number of status effects. I was really shocked to see that even at just 2 status effects present in this kind of scenario, it is already like the best node that we can slot. It just goes to show how incredibly important penetration is and how important it is to reach that cap. So past these 2 status effects, we actually move into a range where there is no possible way that Biting Aura, Deadly Aim, Master at Arms, and Thaumaturge could possibly beat out Force of Nature. And even at 2 status effects, it is pretty unlikely. I really love the flexibility that this offers here to go medium armor in a group that doesn't have any additional penetration support. Now keep in mind, you do have to give up a champion point node for this. It isn't just free penetration, and generally the lowest node that will be dropping would be somewhere in the 3 to 3.5% damage increase range. So I think Alkosh is still the better route to go if your group is planning around everyone wearing medium armor, rather than having all of the damage dealers give up a node to slot this. But not all groups will go that route, so if you find yourself in a group that doesn't have Alkosh and you want to do medium armor, this is a really nice option. Okay, and finally, we'll look at our last example. This will be a light armor setup, so 6 light pieces and 1 medium. In this example, we have 8154 weapon and spell damage, 62.3% crit chance, and then all of the other stats are the same, and we are again assuming we are at the penetration cap. So most of our results are very similar here to the 6 medium setup, with just a few percent differences in some of the nodes. They are all still in the same general area and distance apart though. However, with this one, I wanted to look at Force of Nature again, and the value we would get if that meant we could swap some light armor pieces out for some medium pieces. Maybe we have a body set that is light and a front bar set that is medium, so that gives us some wiggle room to change the light body pieces to our jewelry and run more of that medium set on our body or something along those lines. So interestingly enough, it does seem like it might be worth it once you hit that +3 medium pieces range. The stats on medium armor are a little bit better when we are considering being at the penetration cap for either type worn. You do also have to consider the crit damage cap as well, and in this made up scenario, we were 10% under it, so that allowed these medium pieces to hold their full value. So might not be worth quite this much if you aren't getting that consistently from them. All of this is pretty volatile really, and hard to give exact answers on. So here are all 3 examples again for reference. Every situation might end up slightly different for which of the 4 nodes actually come out on top for you. Thankfully, the difference in slotting your 4th best node and your 5th or 6th best node are probably going to be like 1% or less, so you probably really won't notice much of a difference if you don't always make the exact right call, as long as you know what your top few are, your top 2 or 3, and you're pretty confident about that. It's not gonna really matter too much. We have crit damage caps and penetration caps, so none of this will ever be perfect like it can be on paper, but hopefully this gives you a general idea of the range you'll want those 4 upper right nodes to be in to consider slotting them, and just overall how these nodes all stack up to one another. I think in general we'll want to look at the crit damage or penetration nodes first, decide if we need them or not, and then kind of work our way down from there, filling in the next best options. So I hope that was helpful and not too confusing. I know it is a bit more nuanced than it was in previous patches, and it's not super straightforward. It would be easier if I could just say, hey, slot these 4, these do the most damage, but I'm actually kind of glad it doesn't work that way. ESO has very intentionally gone the situational route with many different aspects of their combat, like skill choice, gear choice, and champion points, without clear winners for all scenarios, and I'm pretty happy about that. I think it makes the game feel a lot more dynamic and interesting overall. That's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you all think about the champion point changes and any ideas you might have for the system going forward. I want to give a big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. There are ways to help support the channel and keep these guides coming for as little as $3. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, BlakeWin816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Nalandia, and my wonderful wife. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.